San Marcos, Austin area weather looks like cloudy and warmer today. Slight chance of rain through tomorrow. Wind should be southeasterly at 8 to 18 miles per hour. High today of 85, a low tonight of 76. Currently cloudy skies, 79 degrees at KRMH. My guest this morning is one individual who I admire because he has taken his subject matter that he works on day to day firsthand, by and large. He's got a new part of a book out. That doesn't make sense. He is part of a book that's coming out, or has come out. The chapter on which he worked is called "The Case of the Wrangling Professors." That pricked my interest a little bit. He's been with us before from the University of Texas Government Department. Dr. Larry Dodd. Welcome back, Larry.
Good morning, Art.
Nice to have you here. Exactly who were the two wrangling professors you and Alan Sager were writing about?
Well, the election we're talking about here was the 1974 Congressional election in the 21st District of Texas, which used to be O.C. Fisher's district. And the two wrangling professors were Doug Harlan, who was teaching at the University of Texas LBJ School at the time, and Bob Krueger, who had been teaching, and in fact had been Dean of Liberal Arts at Duke University up until the spring of 1973 and had returned home to New Braunfels and was running for the congressional seat of the Democrat.
Mm-hmm. Now, how was it that you and Dr. Alan Sager came to write about this?
Well, in 1973, early 74, we were contacted by Alan Clem, who was putting together, hopefully he thought, a book on various congressional elections. He wanted a Texas election. And at that point, Alan and I had met Bob Krueger of New Braunfels and had become rather infatuated with him. And when the opportunity came to do an election, we responded by saying, if Bob Krueger wins the primary, we think that he is such a character, I mean that in a positive sense, such a character with such potential in Texas politics that we will go ahead and do the article. And so it was a combination of opportunity to do the article and our infatuation with Bob Krueger.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't Alan Sager work a little bit or work kind of on the periphery of the Krueger campaign?
When Krueger returned to Texas, he began to set up a political organization. He returned in around June of 1973, and by October, he was putting together a political organization to run for Congress in that area. And he contacted an individual of our department, Harrison Wagner, who was an old friend of his from Duke, and asked who around here is interested in political campaigns. And
he calls the government department.
Yes.
19 hands immediately go up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the process, both Alan and I were early contacted. I did not get involved in the campaign myself. Alan became involved initially in some of the early strategizing, but after an initial involvement in the campaign, I think he more or less withdrew from it, and thereafter our interest in it was by and large academic.
Mm-hmm. Now, this campaign is interesting in that a lot of people, maybe a lot of them aren't listening this morning because probably most of them are in New York, but a lot of people from this immediate area, not just from New Braunfels and not just from the West Texas area, but a lot of people are involved. A local advertising agency was involved.
That's right.
For example.
The campaign, well, Doug Harlan taught at LBJ School. He received his law degree as well as his PhD in political science here at the university and was well known in this campus and in this town. His campaign was in part supported by and run by people from the Austin area. And the same was true with Krueger. His campaign directors and so forth were Gary Morrow and Bob Tommy Henderson, both of whom now live here in Austin, work here in Austin. And both campaigns drew heavily on Austin talent and Austin friends.
Is that significant, do you think? Was it significant in the race in terms of the outcome?
Well, that's hard to say. I think that it's certainly true that in Krueger's case, he did not have the political expertise, the political background, the political knowledge of the state or of his district. And it took a really tough set of campaign workers to combine with his personality, which was an excellent asset, to help them win the election. And I think he was extremely lucky to have come along with Gary Morrow and Tommy Henderson.
Two pretty young guys. Those
They're
guys
young
not
guys, but
very old.
they're tough politicos already.
Yeah.
They had been
Ain't
experienced.
that the truth?
Experienced in earlier political campaigns, starting I think at A&M.
Both of them are two ex-A&M boys.
That's right.
They grow 'em
And,
mean down there, up there.
They played a fair game, but a very tough game.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, Krueger and his personality is very moralistic, very above board, self-righteous, and he was able to keep himself above the fray in an immediate sense and project, a very honest, outgoing kind of "I'm not a politician" image, while his campaign workers could run a very hard campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And
Now,
they
who
did.
was directing Doug Harlan's campaign?
Doug Harlan.
Ah.
Doug did his doctoral dissertation as a case study of congressional campaign techniques and had a lot of faith, justifiably so, in his own political expertise. And I think it would be fair to say that he ran his campaign and
Yeah.
no one else ran it for him. In some ways that may have hurt him slightly because it meant that he was having not only to be the candidate but also to make most of the major decisions. Whereas in the case of Krueger and Morrow and Henderson and another staff person, Alaire George, who came with Krueger from Duke, they sat down early in the campaign, outlined a strategy, and thereafter Krueger campaigned and was not deeply involved in the day-to-day decision-making. And he really husbanded his strength to make the long race.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that towards the end, Harlan was becoming very festy, and I think was obviously rather tired because he was playing two roles, both of which were full-time roles.
Yeah, they had to overcome someone who had kind of an inside route, a state senator, former Senator Wolf, I think it was.
Yes, there actually were two very real campaigns here. First of all, the campaign for the Democratic primary nomination. In the case of Doug Harlan, he did not really have a contested primary race. Krueger did. And in fact, Krueger was dramatically the underdog. You have to have some background knowledge here. Krueger had been Dean of Liberal Arts at Duke up until the spring of '73. He had not lived in New Braunfels or in Texas for 18 years. He
Virtually an outsider.
Yes,
foreigner.
virtually an outsider. His family was an old and strong New Braunfels family, an old German family. But he had not been home for any extensive time in 18 years. He returned home, announced like in November that he was running for Congress, and it was considered generally a laugh. Nelson Wolff was running from San Antonio. He was state senator at the time, a very popular state senator, a very attractive candidate, one of the golden-haired boys of San Antonio politics, and a very competent state senator. Everyone thought that Wolff would win. And unfortunately for Wolff, the state was going through a constitutional convention at the time.
Of which he was one of the
And he was one of the main
movers.
directors. He was
Yeah.
a chair of one of the main committees. And so, thinking he had the race won, I think, he concentrated his attention in Austin, all the while Krueger, through an enormous amount of money and personal time and effort, made it into the runoff because there were about 5 or 6 candidates running, including John Porter, who took a sizable proportion of the West Texas vote. Enough so that there was a runoff, and Krueger then really threw himself into the runoff and therefore won the primary. But that was only the first wave of a two-stage process. He then had to run against Doug Harlan, and once again, people thought that Harlan had the inside track.
Harlan being the Republican.
Yes, Harlan was a Republican. As early as 1972, political analysts had been saying that once O.C. Fisher, the sitting congressman at the time, once he retired, that district would go Republican. The district includes North San Antonio, the Republican Hill Country area, and then extends out to Del Rio and the border. It's a huge district, larger than 22 states, in fact, and it did look like the kind of Texas district that, once the incumbent faded from the scene, would go Republican.
In that West Texas area, do they usually go for a Republican
Not in
candidate?
the West Texas area, but certainly in San Antonio and the Hill Country area. And in fact, if one looked at the overall voting in the last 6 years, at the national presidential level and at the senatorial level, the district had, by and large, had majorities for the national Republican candidates, not for state candidates, but for national Republican candidates. And Harlan thought that he could build on this national Republican orientation of the district, and that, in fact, he would be able to picture Krueger as a liberal, which Harlan was convinced Krueger was, and thereby sweep the general election.
Yeah, well, now was Harlan from one of those areas? It seems like everybody running for this race except for Wolf was from some other place. Harlan being from Austin?
Harlan was from San Antonio.
He was from San Antonio.
He had lived there most of his life. His parents were teachers in San Antonio, and he had been deeply involved in San Antonio Republican politics for many, many years. He had really cultivated this district. And in fact, Harlan ran against O.C. Fisher in 1972 and ran up a fairly nice margin. I think he received around 40% of the vote against incumbent Fisher in 72. And so he thought that he was going to have a real opportunity to take the district over.
Yeah, and therein sets the stage for what turned into be a very interesting race. Before we go on and get deeper into the case of the Wrangling Professors, did the two professors like each other?
The two professors were as different as night and day, and they did not particularly care a whole lot for the other one. Krueger was a Shakespearean scholar, a very cultivated person, considered himself not to be a politician, but rather a concerned citizen, quote unquote. Harlan liked politics, liked being considered a politician, considered himself to be an excellent politician, and did not like what he saw in Bob Krueger as a person coming into a field he had no expertise in and trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. And very early on they were able, in politics it's very important to be able to consider yourself the person who is in the right and the other person the person in the wrong, particularly in a case like this where you're having to put enormous personal energy. And each candidate was quite able to convince himself that the other candidate deserved to be defeated.
Yeah, we'll come back and talk about the case of the Wrangling Professors on the other side of the news. My guest this morning from the University of Texas Government Department, Dr. Larry Dodd. We'll be back on the other side. It is 8:15 right here at Stereo 104. ABC News is next. This is Art Young. My guest this morning, Dr. Larry Dodd from the University of Texas Department of Government, part of a new book out about the making of congressmen around the country. His particular part, along with Alan Sager, called The Case of the Wrangling Professors, two professors being Bob Krueger and Doug Harlan. Krueger, of course, went on to win that congressional seat, and it seems incongruous to me that somebody who was the Shakespearean expert and dean of liberal arts at Duke University could come back into an area that O.C. Fisher had ruled literally for I don't know how many years, 20 years probably, and then win. What did he have to do in terms of the election, in terms of the campaigning, to overcome that stigma of being a pointy-headed Northeastern liberal?
Well, just to reinforce what you've said, Art, it really is incredible. O.C. Fisher had been in Congress since around 1941. He was considered one of the most conservative members of Congress. And by contrast, here was Krueger, who was a very well-educated individual of what might be considered the northern elite or the northeastern elite coming in from Duke. What Krueger had to do several things. First of all, he had to make it very clear that he was actually a Texan, that he was from New Braunfels, and that he loved the people there, and loved them so much, in fact, that he was willing to give up a very successful career in academics and come back and want to serve the people. And that really is the image he began to convey. He began to take what appeared to be a detriment, not having lived back home in 18 years, and turn it into an asset by saying, look, my commitment to this campaign and to you is really much greater than either Nelson Wolf's or Doug Harlan's, because I left a really flourishing career where I had tenure at Duke and so forth, and have returned without any guarantee of success here because I want to serve you, because the country has real problems that I want to help resolve. And he was able to create that mystique. A second thing he was able to do was, within around a 9-month to a year period, develop what I call a series of myths about himself.
Myths?
Myth. He's a great myth maker, and his career is a career built on myth. I don't mean that in a negative sense either. To Krueger, myth and symbol are the way in which people communicate with each other. He is, after all, a Shakespearean scholar, a connoisseur of literature, and he sees the use of myth, the use of symbol, as a way of communicating values. And what he did was to emphasize that he was concerned about the business world by emphasizing the business background of his family.
Which is extensive.
Which is extensive. He purchased some cattle immediately upon his return and emphasized that when he was a young boy he rode the ranges with his uncle, and he was now an owner of cattle. He went to virtually every cattle show in West Texas in his district.
No small task.
No small task.
He walked thousands of them.
He walked every one of those small towns in West Texas extensively 3 and 4 and 5 times. So he was able to create this image, this myth of himself as rancher businessman who once, many, many years ago in another life, may for a moment have served in academics. And within a year he had really been able to shake that academic background and had established himself as a hometown businessman and as the concerned rancher. A third thing that he did was to establish himself as a conservative. In 1972, he had voted for McGovern. He openly admitted that he had voted for McGovern. And in his district, that was not a very popular thing because McGovern did worse in that district practically than any other district in the state. And Krueger established himself over a period of 6 to 9 months as a conservative by emphasizing, first of all, a series of myths or symbols about himself and his concern for the people, by de-emphasizing issues, by emphasizing that his support for McGovern had been a question of principle, that he had seen what Richard Nixon was really like and therefore had voted for McGovern, not because he agreed with McGovern on issues, but as a protest against Nixon. And in the Watergate summer of '74, that began to sell.
I'll bet it did.
Yes.
Were those valid? I guess that's the obvious question you have to ask. Were those myths about being a Wrangler hometown businessman who is also a conservative and who is also basically a Texas cowboy, are all those things valid? Those symbols you're talking about?
Well, he was none of those things in the most absolute sense. I mean, he had not been riding around in North Carolina in an old Jeep or pickup with boots on and so forth. I mean, he was a very cosmopolitan person. And I dare say that back at Duke had shown very little of this Texas origin that he had. In fact, his pronunciation of words, his accent is very much the accent of a person who studied at Oxford, not a person who was raised in New Braunfels. But I think one has to understand Krueger's conception of politics, at least as I have been able to bring some coherence to this. And that is that to Krueger, politics is a process of persuasion in which one tries to identify with the people and with their values and reason with them and both learn from them and try to change them. And a primary way of communicating with people is through symbol. And to him, if the use of symbol and myth taps an underlying dimension of agreement between him and the people, which he thought it did, because he really did think that he had these underlying values, then it was justifiable and was far better than just emphasizing very crassly issues which probably would not tap the real underlying unity between himself and the people. In a very curious way, I would describe Bob Krueger as a Jimmy Carter Democrat. And in fact, if you look at Krueger's campaign 2 years ago, it's really a forerunner of the campaign that Carter has run. That is, emphasizing love. That was a theme over and over. In
Love,
L-O-V-E. Over and over he emphasized love of country, love of people, the decency of the people underlying the problems of Watergate and so forth.
And it's hard to be against love.
It's hard to be against love. As Doug Harlan said, Krueger would go to these state fairs and so forth, or county fairs throughout West Texas. He would stand up and give a 3-minute speech on his love of America, and you could just see spines tingling in the audience and tears coming to people's eyes, because after all, it has been some time in this country, up until this year at least, since we had the old-fashioned politics of love and compassion and the old-fashioned stumping And that's the kind of thing that Krueger did. He's very much like Jimmy Carter, or perhaps Carter's very much like Krueger, because Krueger tried it first, I think. And he was very successful at it.
Yeah. Well, he sure was. Sure was. Interesting man who may be at home for all I know. I don't know whether he's at the convention or not. If he's at home, he may be listening to us.
I suspect he's probably in New Braunfels right now.
Well, Bob Krueger, if you're listening, someday we may be giving you a call to let the man himself come on. And you know, it occurs to me that what better person to be a statesman or a politician than a Shakespearean actor?
Well, I laughed about this. I think that's true.
As long as he doesn't do Hamlet.
Well, there was a big debate in his campaign, in fact, as to which of the Shakespearean characters he was most like.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of the Wrangling Professors, here on the one hand we had a political scientist, and Harlan epitomized political science in its conception of campaigns. And when you talk to Doug Harlan, one could appear to be almost reading a political science textbook in how to run a campaign and how to emphasize issues and all of this kind of thing. Against him you had the Shakespearean scholar who had read very few political science textbooks and so forth on campaigning, didn't care about that, and approached the campaign very much in terms of the kinds of orientations one might bring out of literature, and emphasizing personal character of himself and the individual. And I decided after watching these two candidates that perhaps one can learn a lot more about politics by reading Shakespeare than sometimes reading political science.
Yeah.
And I really mean that, because there is a sense in which the kinds of personal interactions, personal character and so forth, personal strength that it takes to run a campaign, that is not derived from the study of political science, but from the study of other kinds of things like theology and literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what Krueger had going for him, much as anything else.
Yeah. I want to come back and talk about the personality politics versus the party politics and issue politics when we return. Dr. Larry Dodd from the University Department of Government is my guest this morning. If you have a question for him, give me a call. 477-2251 in Austin, 392-9926 in San Marcos. Dr. Larry Dodd from the University Department of Government is my guest this morning. We're talking about the case of the Wrangling Professors, Bob Krueger and Doug Harlan, when they were running for that congressional seat. You were telling me about the expenses on this race when it all was tallied up. What was the result?
Well, Art, the campaign of Bob Krueger ended up being the most expensive congressional campaign in the nation in 1974, and there is some evidence that it may well have been the most expensive. When I say congressional, I mean House campaign. It may well have been the most expensive campaign for the House of Representatives in the nation's history. Overall, it's hard to get the precise figures, but Krueger's campaign ran somewhere between $450,000 and $550,000. And there are some real reasons for that.
I'll bet there was.
First of all, this is one of the largest congressional districts in the nation. It's larger than 22 states. It runs from San Antonio out to the border. And there are three very distinct areas. There's the San Antonio area, there is the Hill Country area distinct from that, and then the West Texas area. And
which is distinct from anything.
Distinct from anything, yes. And in order to reach most of the constituents in this district, one has to use media markets that are largely outside of the district. That is, it is not like campaigning in Jake Pickle's district here, where the media market of Austin can by and large reach most of the district. There was no way that any one media market could reach most of this district, and so you had to use Austin, you had to use San Antonio, you had to use the Midland-Odessa area, and so forth.
San Angelo, I would guess.
San Angelo, even down to Corpus and out to El Paso.
That's
now,
the entire state.
In the long run, that's a real asset to whomever is the member of this district, if that person has senatorial ambitions or gubernatorial ambitions. But in the short run, it makes a very difficult financial situation for a person who is running, particularly in Krueger's case, with almost no name identification and almost no background. When Krueger first entered the race, a poll was taken, and he had 1% name ID in this area, and it's incredibly low to start a campaign.
Sounds like Jimmy Carter's name identification when he started.
So that was one problem, just the size of this district and Krueger's lack of background in politics. The second problem was that there were three distinct races. There was the first primary race, which was very heated, then the primary runoff race, which was very heated and very close, and the general election. Now, most candidates around the country, most campaigns, have at most one heated, close election. In fact, most of them are rather safe incumbents right now. To have 3 close elections or parts of an election like this really runs the bill up enormously. And so you take the size of the district plus the heated nature of the competition in 3 distinct stages, and the end product was a very expensive race.
Mm-hmm. So people have told me, and just my brief running into some of the things that went on in the public relations campaign, that the public relations standpoint of a campaign was a tour de force in this.
It absolutely was.
This was Roy Spence.
Roy Spence from Austin, who was an undergraduate here at UT and decided to begin his own public relations operation. He ran the public relations campaign for Krueger, and there were just some brilliant decisions on the part of Spence and Krueger.
Mm-hmm. Like what, for example?
Well, for example, they emphasized newspaper printouts or publications in the small West Texas towns. In around February of 1974, one of the San Antonio newspapers ran an article on San Antonio politics in which they discussed the nature of elite politics in San Antonio and how 10 to 15 individuals really made the major decisions in San Antonio, and how these individuals had now chosen Nelson Wolff to be the next congressperson from that area, because San Antonio deserved to have the new congressperson, since O.C. Fisher had been a West Texas congressman for the district. Krueger and Spence took that article in the San Antonio newspaper and ran 3 or 4 or 5 pages in virtually every small West Texas community, starting off with the headline, "Do you want 10 San Antonio men to choose your next congressman? If so, don't read the next 10 pages," or however long it was. And that was a beautiful ploy. It turned the West Texas and Hill Country people against San Antonio and Wolff, and in the terms of the San Antonio newspapers.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if Krueger and Spence had to throw any personal mud. They merely cited and repeated what the San Antonio newspapers had been saying.
Stroke of genius.
And it really struck home. And the decision to run a newspaper campaign in part, the decision to isolate different constituencies in this district and campaign to them in their own terms, in other words, in different terms to the different constituencies, was a major decision that they made that turned out to be very successful.
For example, you're saying they would
They
treat the urban
with the
people.
Chicano district, and Krueger was one of the few politicians in the West Texas area to ever walk the Chicano areas. He did not speak Spanish, at least not very fluently, but he did walk those districts and tried to communicate with those people. On the other hand, he also walked the San Antonio area and emphasized different campaign issues. And you can see a real contrast here. In Doug Harlan's case, Harlan had a set speech and he set a number of issues. And every place Harlan went, he gave that speech and emphasized those issues. And he tried to make this into a positive part of his campaign, that wherever he was, he said the same thing, and he was consistent. On the other hand, what Krueger did was not to say the opposite things in different places, but to emphasize different things in different places. In one place he might emphasize mosquito eradication or whatever. Another place he would emphasize mass transit. And so he really identified the differing constituencies and tried to speak to them in terms of their own symbols, their own problems, their own issues. And the media campaign of Roy Spence reflected the attempt to identify the different constituencies in this huge congressional district, and to talk to them in their own terms, their own issues, and their own symbols. And that takes a great deal of effort to do that. And it's much easier to run a simple, straightforward campaign that throws out the same stimuli to all of the people and just very mass orientation. The kind of campaign that Krueger ran in terms of a media campaign and so forth was a very sophisticated campaign, and a lot of credit is owed by Krueger to Roy Spence.
Yeah. Larry, a lot of things have been written, especially since '64, the Goldwater debacle, because of dealing with personality politics as opposed to party politics or issue-oriented politics. Some political scientists say that if you ride on a personality, 9 out of 10 times you're going to lose. We look at
Yes.
McGovern, we look at Barry Goldwater, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Usually with party backing or with issue backing, people with the same issue, those people tend to win. This is not the case here. Krueger was solely a personality, I don't want to say solely, but by and large a personality rather than an issue-oriented man. Why did he win? How can you explain him winning over those kinds of odds?
Well, much like Jimmy Carter, in fact, he was very determined, Krueger was. He threw everything he had into it. When he decided to run, and I think he really had decided to run as soon as he returned to Texas or even prior to returning, but when he really entered the race, say in October or November of '73, from that moment, he did not stop. I mean, he put 18 and 20 hours a day in. It was incredible, and he was able to hold up physically through this, while the other people all viewed him as a lark. And, you know, he really edged out things by only 1,000 and 2,000 votes, particularly in the primaries. And so a first major part was simply his own personal commitment. I think a second thing was that it was a year of Watergate, the year of disillusionment with politics as usual. And Krueger came along emphasizing character, emphasizing morality, a love of country, and so forth. And this hit a real chord in the people. Third, he had a lot of money. His family is well off. He was able to raise a lot of money, and also he's a real gambler. I don't mean that in his personal life, private life, but he really did gamble in the campaign. Krueger had faith in himself, as strange as that may, or melodramatic as that may say. He had faith in himself, and he put a lot of money out front, $100,000, $200,000 early on, money that would have been extremely hard to have raised to pay off debts had he lost. In fact, he had a fair amount of trouble, even after having won, initially paying off that debt. And so he put a lot of money out front, really gambled, whereas in the case of Doug Harlan, for example, Harlan did not spend money, by and large, until he had the money or had it fairly well committed. And Harlan's money did not come in until very late in the campaign, at a point that it was really too late to use the money effectively and wisely. Krueger had simply gambled all the way, that he would win and that he could pay the debts off eventually. And so he planned his campaign on the assumption of having money. And of course, coming from a fairly wealthy family, he could at least put a little bit forward himself. He wasn't worrying about where his meal would come from the next day personally. And he wasn't worrying about what kind of a job he would have if he lost, because his family did have a family business and so forth. But, you know, the nature of the times, his own commitment, having some money, and the fact that Bob Krueger is one of the most eloquent people that you will ever meet in American politics. And also one of the most personable people, very much like Carter again. When he went to these small towns and walked the streets, when he went to the cattle shows, he was a very personable individual and extremely eloquent. In fact, he has, in Washington now, I would say that Krueger has become the fastest rising freshman member of Congress in the post-war years.
Yeah.
His eloquence has just captivated members of Congress in the House, both those who support him and those who oppose him, and it captivated his district.
Yeah. You've been drawing parallels to Jimmy Carter throughout this hour and talking about Krueger and the kind of appeal he has and the kind of constituency he seems to have. Can we extend that logic? Is it safe to say that that same kind of feeling of the need for more morality in government as opposed to issue-oriented men will carry Jimmy Carter into the presidency? You think it is?
I think so, but you have to have a qualification here, that when one runs on character and morality and love, you're playing very dangerous kinds of politics. And if close examination of one's background or of one's campaign reveals the candidate not to live up to those kinds of standards, then the campaign can fall apart very rapidly. And it takes a real ability to maintain that over a long period of time. both in one's personal life as well as in one's political rhetoric, to carry off a campaign like that. And I think that Carter does have an approach, and it may really be part of Jimmy Carter. I mean, I have this personal feeling that Carter's religious orientation is not a sham, that what you see is what Carter really is. I was raised Southern Baptist myself and in North Texas, and I've seen lots of individuals like Carter, and I think I can identify a fairly genuine person. But if he's not, then his campaign can really be demolished. It's a very dangerous kind of campaign. There's much more leeway given to the politician who admits he's a politician than to the politician who claims that he'll never lie to you.
Yeah.
And once some lies begin to come forth, it may really shake a lot of people up, if in fact they do come forth.
Larry Dodd from the University of Texas Department of Government is my guest this morning. We're talking about the case of the Wrangling Professors, and we'll see how the winning Wrangling Professor has done on Capitol Hill when we return on the other side. If you have a question for Larry, we'll take them now. 477-2251 in Austin, 392-9926 in San Marcos, 13 before 9 at KRMH.
Pieces of legislation really involved here. Legislation throughout most of 1975 to deregulate the price of oil, to decontrol oil prices in this country. And the second wave, or the second piece of legislation, was a bill rather similar to Lloyd Benson's bill in the Senate to deregulate the price of natural gas, and essentially to try to make people in the rest of the country pay more or less what we in Texas have been paying for natural gas. In our state, the intrastate gas prices more or less reflect what are considered to be market mechanisms, and the value is not depressed by any regulation or control. But nationally, interstate prices are regulated, so we pay 2 and 3 and 4 times the price for intrastate gas in the state as the nation at large pays for the interstate gas. And both Benson and then Krueger have been trying to change the interstate gas regulation and essentially to deregulate it, where it would reflect the market value of gas. And a very controversial bill, both first with oil and then later with gas.
The first time it didn't pass. His version didn't pass.
No, but it's a very complicated situation. I was in Washington not for the natural gas controversy, but for the oil controversy. And it's an extremely complicated situation, complicated pieces of legislation, but very dramatic. And in fact, it is the kind of legislation of which great tales are told. In the case of both natural gas and oil, the two principal actors in the House were Texans. Believe it or not, the leader of the attempt to maintain controls on oil and on natural gas was Bob Eckhart of Houston. And then the leader of those wishing to decontrol the price of oil and of natural gas was Bob Krueger. And I think Krueger will freely admit to you that everything he learned about oil and natural gas, he learned from Bob Eckhart.
Wouldn't be a bit surprised.
They were, and I think that they still are, friends. And Eckhart knew Krueger's general stance. But they are both gentlemen and worked well together, even though adversaries.
Were they representing their respective constituents? Was Eckhart representing his constituency?
No.
And
it's not at all that simple. Eckhart's district has the largest petrochemical complex in the world in it. And it is the district of Shell, Oil Company, and so forth. In fact, he's currently involved in a very heated campaign for re-election in which the oil interests seem to be opposing him. So it was not the case
See why.
that, I'm talking about general elections.
Yeah,
though.
yeah.
It is not the case that one had oil interests, the other did not. They had different conceptions of how to handle the energy problem in this country and different political calculations and so forth. But in Krueger's case, as a freshman, he went on to the Commerce Committee, and in the Commerce Committee was able to get on to the Energy Subcommittee that Eckhart also sits on. And that is the subcommittee that was writing both the control of oil and decontrol of natural gas legislation. On that committee, he became a prime actor and the prime opponent, leader of the opposition to Eckhart, who was the prime leader for control. And Krueger's career in the last 2 years, both in regard to this legislation as well as in regard to some other legislation, has been absolutely remarkable. It is almost unheard of for a freshman member of Congress to become the floor manager and the legislative leader for a major piece, even for a minor piece, but certainly for a major piece of legislation. In Krueger's case, he has become floor manager of these bills. He's become the central actor in the House on these bills. He's been written up, now in the New York Times and so forth, as well as the Washington Post. He has really stamped his mark and his personality on the House. And between Eckhart and Krueger, Texas is really making a mark on the House. 2 years ago, Eckhart was chosen as one of the 10 brightest members of Congress. And I suspect that in a coming poll in the next year or two, Bob Krueger will be in that same poll. And they are really transforming the nature of debate in the House.
I'll bet they are.
Because they are both brilliant, eloquent men, and they're on the opposite sides of the issues in these cases. But Krueger has really left his mark, and there is already a fair amount of talk that Bob Krueger may feel rather constrained in the House and will be looking to move up to the Senate.
Would you think he would be looking up anytime soon? Like, for
Yes.
example, John Tower's seat?
John Tower's seat in 78 is a very... Now, I have no inside information, but I would think that Tower's case and his seat in 78 would be a very likely move. I don't think that Krueger will ever want to run for the Benson seat as long as Benson's around, which can be a number of years yet. And the Tower seat looks inviting. Tower has been hurt by internal Republican politics this year in the Ford-Reagan race in Texas. He's been weakened, as has that party. Krueger has lots of money coming into him and his campaigns now as a result of his stance on oil and gas legislation. He is receiving lots of support.
Will that corrupt him?
His district, as I mentioned earlier, is a beautiful district from which to begin to launch a statewide race. And if he uses media effectively in his re-election efforts this year, which really should not be too difficult, I think, in his area to win re-election, but if he uses media well this time, he will be advertising his name across half the state. And, he's already becoming a well-known person here in Austin.
Yeah.
Because the Austin media is picking up on him.
And we're giving him an hour.
Yeah, an hour here.
Yes.
And he's receiving...
Send your check, Bob Krueger, to Art Young and Larry
similar
Dodd.
attention, throughout the other parts of the state.
He's an interesting man.
Yeah.
Interesting man. What about that? What about all that money coming in and the moralist, the Shakespearean moralist who ran in the beginning? Will that money corrupt him? Will that turn him into just another political hack who will do anything if the price is right?
Bob Krueger has at least several attributes. He has a magical use of words, and he can wrap a web of magic around you when he speaks with you that's incredible. Secondly, he has the ability to convey to you that he believes what he's doing is right. I mean, it's incredible. I had been working with Bob Eckhart, to be honest, on the oil legislation last year, and I went to a meeting with Krueger. Within 5 minutes of talking to Krueger, I began to search my mind. Now, what were those reasons that I was supporting the Eckhart approach? Because he does have this ability to captivate people. And with that ability, I don't want to take a stand on whether or not he really does believe what he's doing is right, but he certainly is able to convince you that he believes it's right. And there is some basis, of course, in terms of energy problems in this country, at least for assuming that the orientation he's taking to the energy problems are not solely based on political calculations in Texas.
Yeah. Dr. Larry Dodd from the University Department of Government, we have run out of time. We've been talking about the case of the Wrangling Professors, and someday we may be having Bob Krueger himself on to talk about his wrangling, past and future. Larry Dodd, thank you for coming out this morning.
Thank you, Art.
Claudette Coben talked to us about